Hello, hello. Okay. So good evening, everyone, and welcome. We're about to start the next event here, so we might actually get that door closed once everyone is finished filtering out. But welcome. My name is Safira. I serve as a representative for the Baha'i International Community. We're wanting to have kind of an open, more participatory dialogue here today, and we have a wonderful panel who I will introduce. But as we're kind of hearing from our panelists, I will invite you to listen and think about how you might engage. Maybe there are questions that come to mind as you're listening. Maybe there are comments that also come. So we're wanting this to be less of a panel and more of an open dialogue with all of us in the room. So we're going to be looking at a values-based approach to food systems. And we've asked each of our lovely panelists tonight to give us a little bit of food for thought in terms of a values-based approach to food systems to get the conversation rolling. And so I'm going to introduce Roy Steiner. We have Lucy Wallace. We have Thomas Legrand. And I hope, Thomas, we can either see you online and hopefully you can hear us. If you're there, we can't actually... Yes, you're here.
Yes.
We can see you.
Yes, I'm here. I'm hearing you.
Perfect.
Hello,
and you
everyone.
can hear us. Wonderful. Yeah. And we have Gabriella and Jan. So I'll invite them to introduce themselves with a little bit more detail. But I will pass to Roy to kick us off and just share some initial thoughts about what we're thinking when it comes to a values-based approach, maybe some of the questions that are coming up for you, Roy, in your work, and particularly looking at the application of values to food systems. So over to you, Roy.
Great, thank you. This is, I think, the final event of the first week of COP, and I hope everybody has had a rewarding few days. You know, it's interesting. I started thinking about this issue, and I'm the senior vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation in charge of food systems. And about 5 years ago, we started asking this question of what is the kind of food system we want, and how do you actually create that food system? And what was interesting is, you know, different people have different ideas, and we decided, well, let's ask people the kind of food system they want. Let's create a vision prize, actually. And it turns out no one's ever given a prize for a vision of the future. We thought that was interesting. And part of that was based on the fact that when we looked at all the books and movies about the future, 98% of them were dystopian. They're all dark. They're Mad Max, Hunger Games, the list goes on. 2%, Star Trek, for example, is the only one that creates a world that you would actually want to live in. And that's a problem, because if you can't envision it, you can't create it. And we started asking, why is it that we have so much dystopian and almost none? What if we make all the right decisions? And in order to create a vision of the future, we had to create a vision design toolkit, which is, because no one had ever done this before, what is the process by which you create a vision of the future? And we had to prototype this. It turned out that, you know, because no one had done this, we didn't know how it would go. When we issued this call for submissions to describe the food system of 2050 that you want to see, we thought maybe a couple of hundred people, 100 organizations would submit. We had over 1,300. It went all over the world. There was such a hunger to envision the future. But as a result, we got lots of experience of thousands of groups trying to envision. And in our toolkit, it turned out that the most important thing you had to do in order to have a really generative and very positive experience was, from the very beginning, identify the values and principles that all the stakeholders in that room agreed with. If you did not start with values and principles, people immediately started to go into conflict or started to get into disagreements, and they had no way to come back to figure out a way through that conflict. But groups that had identified clear values and principles were able to manage the really difficult trade-offs and decisions. And so without values, I don't think, and clarifying our values and principles, and there's potentially a distinction and a lot of overlap there, and we can discuss that a little bit more. I don't think we can create a vision of the future that is possible. So I'll end there. We had 10 Food Prize, Vision Prize winners. There were extraordinary visions, and happy to share more about that. But with that, I will hand it over to Lucy. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm Lucy Wallace. I'm Chief of Staff at EIT Food, and I also lead the Secretariat for the Food Systems Pavilion at COP. So I've taken maybe a slightly a different start on this, maybe a different story. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about regenerative agriculture this year. Regenerative agriculture, it's the term on everybody's lips. It's shown as, it's heralded as being the solution to all of our problems. It's going to help us get healthy, sustainable, resilient, regenerative food systems. But regenerative agriculture is also something which is extremely divisive. The term in itself, regenerative agriculture, I mean, it puts the focus on farmers to make a transition. But then the people who are involved in regenerative agriculture are groups of quite different stakeholders. And they all have a different definition or a different idea of a definition for regenerative agriculture. So what we find is that as people try to define regenerative agriculture, we say, oh, we need to know what this means. You know, we need a shared definition. We need to know how to practice regenerative agriculture, what we do in order to attain regenerative agriculture, in order to tell people we're doing it. And that causes division, it causes conflict. Food systems are incredibly diverse. They're practiced in incredibly diverse ways. And so having one definition for something which is a diverse, complex system is never going to work. So the thinking that I've been doing and I've been discussing with other people is more around actually, so how do we get people aligned around a shared objective? Very much what Roy was saying here. How do you align people around a common goal? And in order to do that, you don't tell them how to practice something. You align on principles, you align on values. And so by having shared values and by having shared values which are co-created with people who maybe take a different view on how you might practice in a diverse system, then you give everybody a common framework. You all agree on something. You agree what those values are, and if you apply those values, then what you achieve is you can maybe achieve regenerative. You reduce the conflict, and you increase the chance of success, and you increase the chance of being able to transform the food system for people and planet. I don't have any of the answers. I don't have any of the answers on what those values should be, and actually it's right that I don't have the answers because it's not down to me. I think it's down to us all collectively to discuss this and to come up with those shared values together, and then apply that in the ways that we apply our approach to food systems, which are incredibly diverse. So I'll finish there, and I really look forward to the discussion that we're all going to have.
Thank you. Thomas, we'll turn over to you to provide some opening thoughts. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for inviting me online. So I'm the lead advisor for the Conscious Food Systems Alliance, convened by UNDP. It's a movement of food agriculture consciousness practitioners focusing on the cultivation of what we call inner capacities for regenerative food systems. So we are basically, supporting each other, learning from each other, collaborating, and integrating the cultivation of inner capacity in our teams, organizations, and projects. So what we call inner capacities encompass values, but also all the inner dimensions, so mindsets, worldviews, transformative qualities and skills, etc. So, we are just receiving a grant from Rockefeller Foundation to work with Region 10 initiative to develop a methodology, a community-led assessment methodology to capture what Region 10 called the non-material dimensions of regeneration, which refers to mental models, but encompass also values, etc. So we are about to start developing this methodology, and we'll have to look, at basically for communities to be able to develop the evolution of their cultures, of their values. And we'll turn to the literature on regeneration, and I agree that values and principles are the ones that can guide us towards regenerative food systems, which is not a fixed destination. It will always be evolving, and that's why values and principles are so important. So, and we are partnering with different organizations who emphasize different values and, in particular, specific philosophies in relation to food systems. So, we can remind ourselves that permaculture, for example, emphasizes three principles or values, care for nature, care for people, and sharing resources, right? In our Conscious Food Systems Alliance, we also are looking at the potential of what we call consciousness approaches and practices. So we have looked into what mindfulness, for example, can bring to food systems transformation, whether through mindful eating or mindful farming. Practices like nature connection, compassion training, non-violent communication, for example, to reduce polarization, in the discussions we are having on food systems. I can quote other values which to me looks very important. Well-being, for example, as an alternative to a kind of mindset emphasizing wealth, economic growth. We see an emerging alternative paradigm emphasizing more well-being, looking also at community solidarity, vitality, trust, whether we emphasize also sovereignty and proactivity versus dependency. So we'll be looking at all that to define, and I think that's, to answer your question, I think just bringing the lens towards the value is the best way to activate them, to be more intentional on aligning our work on these values. And I can end up just quoting, the values that we have set for ourselves within this Conscious Food Systems Alliance convened by UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme. So we have 6 main values that guide our work, which we hope to help us to be, walk the talk of conscious food systems. The first one is to bring our whole selves to this work, including our emotional, embodied, and authentic self. The willingness to undertake the inner work, to look inside. Equity, inclusivity, and acknowledgement of power dynamics. Deep listening, valuing diverse points of view, and embracing complexity and working with emergence. Thank you.
I'm Gabriela Rouhani. I serve as a policy officer for the Baha'i International Community in Geneva. And I would have to say that in order to transform a food system and really look at how we can be applying these fundamental values that have been identified by some of the speakers already, is to also think about where we are now and how we can sort of shift our current understanding of food systems, how they function, and in particular, what we want on a whole. Because first and foremost, part of achieving sort of a common approach means that we need to have a common understanding. And common understanding means that sort of, again, what are these specific values? Whether that be sort of addressing some of the inequalities within those systems and identifying, what does it mean to apply justice to all areas of the entire system from the ground, whether that be with farmers, consumers, producers. And also we need to think of I mean, one thing is to identify what these values are, but another thing is to look at what does that look like in practice. So if we are empathetic towards all actors, individuals, the land itself, what are the outcomes versus thinking of accumulating as much as you can, as fast as you can, which is some of the current values that underlie our system right now. So if we are to think of what else we could identify and what that looks like in action is how we can be more collaborative in our approach, how we can work with communities and how the learning from the level of the community and identifying the specific needs within those communities, and that can be applied to policies. It can also, having this shared vision is ultimately what will allow us to sort of fully embrace an approach that will be more equitable and lead to outcomes that truly transform these systems from where they are now to where we want to be.
Yes, I'm the last panelist. I'm Jan Wolf from the Buddhist Tzu-Chi Foundation. So for those of you who don't know about Tzu-Chi and what it means, it stands for compassion relief. So basically, compassion is at the heart of all of our missions and all of our activities. And when we come to the environment space and the climate crisis and the food systems, obviously, we care a lot about, on the one hand, the planetary health, and we are concerned about the stress our current food system poses on the planetary health and the planetary boundaries which we are in. Obviously, we also have compassion for those people who are left behind, who don't have enough food to eat, while most of us in the developed world, in the rich world, have an abundance of food. And even a lot of food gets wasted nowadays. So we feel it's very, very important to work on all these issues to try to find ways to improve it. And especially in the rich part of the world where many people live in very urban areas, we feel there's quite a strong detachment of consumers on the one hand, consumers of food, and on the other side, the producers of food. So if you live in the Western world, in a big city, you probably have never really experienced how food is actually produced and how much effort is being made to bring that food to your table. All you do is to go to the supermarket or the restaurant and just pay for it. It's just like a good like any other consumer good for you. So we feel that this is that's why it's very important to cultivate the consumers, especially in the wealthy part of the world, to be more mindful about their consumption and to try to take actions in their individual life, but also when they are working together to try to have a more sustainable impact in their own consumption, and especially in the food consumption, because the food crisis and climate crisis are obviously very strongly interlinked. So we know from the IPCC that even if we were phasing out all fossil fuels on time, we still couldn't meet the 1.5 degree targets unless we also look at the food system. So that's why this is very important, and I'm glad to be part of this panel and to be part of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you to each of our speakers, our panelists, for just providing these initial thoughts. I wanted to summarize or just pull out some of the threads that I heard each of you kind of speak to, which are different dimensions of values and value systems. So we touched on being able to create vision design, and a common goal. We touched on definitions and language, having some sort of shared language to articulate that vision. We touched on inner capacities, things like mindset, worldview, how the application of these principles kind of also inform our inner lives. We touched on the coherent application of these values at different levels and at different entry points. We looked at some values that were specifically named, like the equality of access within the food system. What does it mean to have some sort of mindful consumption? And then there was a whole list, which I really appreciated, Thomas, the example that UNDP is drawing on, this list of qualities about how one operates within a system, bringing your whole self to work, deep listening. These are definitely values and also capacities that one builds to become effective in these systems. So I guess I have a question, and I'm going to pose it to our panelists, whoever feels moved to unpack some of these questions a little bit more deeply, but also to our audience to see if anyone is willing to participate and maybe react to some of the things that you've heard initially. But I guess in all of these things that we've heard so far, my question that I would pose to you is, who is shaping these values? Where did the values come from? Is it something that is emerging? Are our value systems something that's emerging with the experience that's emerging? Are there gaps that we feel that are missing that then we identify, okay, this is a value now that needs to be applied in this void? Is it a set of concrete ideas that are timeless qualities that we are always coming back to? So my question is, who shapes the values? Where do they come from? And if we're thinking truly about, we're here at this global climate conference, we're thinking about global food systems. How does a global, interconnected civilization, as the one that we're navigating now, come together to form some sort of consensus about our value system and then act upon it so that it moves beyond the realm of words and an identification of nice ideals, but actually is a system that informs our behavior and our choices and our actions? So who shapes it? Where do our values come from? How do we kind of work together to identify a global set of values? Big questions. All right, Lucy's ready.
As I already said, I've not got all the answers. However, picking up on something that you said then, where do these values come from? I think we already have these values, but the issue is, or the challenge is, that we are conditioned not to act on these values when we're doing business, for example, or when we're operating in a more regulated, constrained environment like a food system. So we may have those values, but we're not applying those values to the systems that we work in, the complex systems. So I don't think it's a fact of that we don't have them or that we need to. They've been lost. I think we definitely have those values. We live those values in different ways. But when we think about food systems, we don't apply those values, and that is down to conditioning. Absolutely. The frameworks that are currently in place do not use those. They don't make use of them. So I think that's a really key point. I don't think it's something that we completely have to invent or pull out of thin air or change who we fundamentally are as human beings. I think we just have to change our mindset and maybe think about a different way of systems change, of food systems.
Well, I maybe have a slightly different perspective. I mean, when you look at how we are making decisions now, they're actually based on pretty narrow, self-interested, materialistic set of values. I think so many of the economic choices that are being made, political choices, are not based on our highest self. They are actually based on our lowest, on kind of the lower nature of humanity. And I think the question for me is like, how do we bring that to the fore? And that's the thing that actually drives our. And I don't think you can do it without mindfulness and without a spiritual practice in a way, because the insistent self is very powerful. It draws us. Self-love is kind of built into the clay of man. You've got to continually be working to elevate yourself and enable yourself to go higher. The one thing is, it was interesting when we did this Food System Vision Prize, when we looked at the set of values that all of these different groups identified, there was like an 80-90% overlap. You know, everybody wants a food system that promotes community and love, right? Everybody wants a food system that preserves the environment. We all want food systems that are just, that are nourishing. But we've created the opposite. We've actually created a food system that destroys our health, destroys our environment, and I think that's because of this lack of a core understanding of our interconnectedness and the core mindfulness that's needed to fight against selfishness and narrow self-interest.
Thomas, I see your hand is raised. Over to you.
Thank you. No, this question speaks to me very much. I mean, I've written also a book called Politics of Being, which talks about, you know, how to make that cultural transformation that we need. I think it's good to recognize that we need, you know, that global change of mindsets. And it's not only about food systems, it's about our cultures, it's about how economy is organized, etc. So I think we need that discussions about how we can organize our societies to be able to make that cultural shift, which I believe has a spiritual dimension. And that should be reflected in the way we, even in the way of what goals do we set for ourselves as society. So my vision, building on what's written in the Earth Charter, is that development is about being more rather than having more and economic growth. So that's something, you know, the food system is embedded in a development paradigm that emphasizes economic growth, and that's where many of the problems are, and how we can rethink, you know, all our systems, in particular starting with education systems, for example, to be able to support that kind of cultural evolution.
I would probably add on to this that it's one thing to identify what these values are and to sort of understand over time how they shape and change the systems that we live in, but it's also important to understand how can we be putting them into action. Because part of putting them into action is that it gives us the ability to acquire knowledge about what is needed, how we can improve, and how we can evolve. Because it's also important that we don't expect that by just identifying a set of maybe 10 or 15 different values, that's our set point. That's it. We've achieved our goal. This is something that's ongoing, and this conversation should continue. It should be something that we think of as well. How can we take these values and apply them to the various areas, not just how we treat each other, but also how the specific technical aspects of those systems operate. So how do we, you know, treat the land? How do we treat the system of moving food from one point to another? How does the consumer sort of value the food or, you know, the products that they buy? Right, and so it requires us to fully and truly understand also the value that's put into each product. And that takes time, and there's care, and that we should really be more conscientious of every aspect of that system and understand that we live in a very interconnected world and that we have access to that information. And it's important that we apply that knowledge, and that in itself should help shape sort of those conversations around what values specifically we want to promote.
Yeah, I wanted to echo on what Roy said. I think on the one hand, we have that mindset and we have that long-term thinking of what we feel is beneficial for us, for planet Earth, for nature. But most of the time in our life, we are driven by the short-term thinking. And we are wondering what a short-term action can bring us as an additional benefit. So just to give you an example, if I would, let's say, have a garden with a beautiful tree on it, and I feel, oh, this tree is actually nice, it's helping the climate, it's converting CO2 to oxygen, it helps biodiversity, it helps the soil in the ground, provides me shade. It's a beautiful tree, but this nature and all the positive effects of this tree doesn't really have any value in my pocket. So if I were to cut down the tree, and then I immediately could realize some sort of value by selling the wood of the tree, because now the tree becomes a wood, it's a commodity. And this is actually the conflicts we are in our everyday lives. So between doing what's good long term and what might benefit us in the short term. So what we feel is very important is to really cultivate the compassion in the people and the mindfulness to help them to make the correct decisions, which might be not necessarily always just satisfying your short-term desires. Yeah.
Can I just pick up on what you were saying there? Sorry, I'm a badly behaved panelist. I have lots of questions and I like to interrupt. You were talking about long-term versus short-term, and I think that's all well and good when we're talking about people who have that choice. But how do you make that operate? And I completely agree. I mean, you know, we need to be looking long term, but how do you make that accessible for people who have no choice? How do you enable them to look long term? How do you enable them to live values when they're living day to day, when they don't have the choice, they don't have the luxury that maybe, you know, I might have if I go to the supermarket, I could make a choice. If I have a tree in the garden, I could make a choice whether or not to chop it down for firewood or whether or not to leave it there for biodiversity and for fruit the next year. How do we make sure that anything that we are doing around values is valuable for everybody, is equitable for everybody, ensures everybody has that choice, ensures everybody has is enabled to be able to do that? It's not an answer, it's a question. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on it.
I don't have an answer to your question, but some further thoughts. I would say, love and everybody, when you say what is a core value that we should embed in every system, everybody talks about love, right? It's a powerful force. We all. And it's not love just for yourself, it's love for everyone. But then we go ahead and design economic systems that are completely perverse. And one of those perverse things is a discount rate, right? When you have to value something, you put a discount rate on it so that things in the future are not as valuable as things right now. What that turns out doing is you create an economic system that values the lives of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren as worth nothing. Our economic system says our grandchildren are worth nothing. Their lives mean nothing. And yet that flies in the face of all of our most fundamental values, right? I would die for my children and my grandchildren. I would give up anything right now if I knew I could make their lives better. But we created an economic system that doesn't do that. Why? I think we've just been blinded by materialism. We've been blinded by that short-term thinking, and therefore we've created this completely unequal. Because it's not just, I would expand your question. It's not just the people who are living today, but we aren't thinking about the people who are living in the future, and so that fundamental value has to be embedded in our fundamental economic systems, and right now we've just created complete perversity.
That is a great example. I'm looking to our audience to see if there are others who might have other examples, reactions, questions. Yes, okay, I see a number of hands, so please, I can pass the microphone to you.
Yes, I would like to share because I hear connection. And it's really important that I feel in today's world, somehow we connect less to people, but instead we connect to media more, everyday life, which I really feel missing because somehow after attending 1 week climate conference, I feel it is important to considering education. But education is not only within school, but maybe preschool. What I can remember is how my grandmother taught me when I was maybe only 3 years old to cook a mung bean soup. And it's a memory forever. So if we can, maybe the parents can spend more time every day to spend time with children instead of not giving them the iPad or mobile phone, but try to be together with some value time with them to build up the connection. And it will affect them and pass on the value to them. Because I think the value we need to have now is not only interconnect people, but also intergeneration. It is very important to able to build up like a tree. Somehow we kind of taking care of the climate tree now when it is small, but we need to secure this tree can become big for the future. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jonathan Nerl. I direct the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. And one of the questions that we've been focusing on at the Faith Pavilion down the road here is the question of how to bring values into the climate conversation. And in regards to food, what would a world look like where houses of worship had their own gardens? What would a world look like where houses of worship had composting systems? And of where clergy preached and taught about local food consumption, plant-based diets. If they don't want to go to plant-based, at least be reducitarians or climatarians. Because in the world we live in today, most clergy are not talking about this issue. It's sort of a non-issue. Religion is one thing and food ethics is another. But in a more repaired world and the world that we need to move to, we need to see religious institutions getting fully on board in terms of values for food ethics and food sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you. Great discussions, panelists. Thank you for your insights. Really building on what the last two questions, if there were questions. I don't know if we're asking questions. So I'll try to frame mine as a question. And it's interesting, you brought in education, you brought in spirituality, but is nature not a part of spirituality and education? And can we have any education? Can we have any spiritual connection to nature if we have so little connection to it? So our food system, and I would love to know, Roy, about in those visions, how often in the overlapping thing, was there a common thread about actually having a life that is connected to nature? And we say that very lightly, but actually, if you look back 100 years, it was so deeply connected because your survival, your livelihood depended on it. We don't need it now to go to our day-to-day. Someone like me grew up on a farm, in Dubai, I almost feel physically sick, it affects me like physiologically, or I just don't feel good. And how long would it take me to transition out of that? Because I grew up on a farm, but, my kids did not grow up on a farm, and they're pretty different to me. So on the values, do we need to force somehow? And force is a strong word, but we talk about that a lot in environmental action. What role does policy play as a top-down force, combined with bottom-up forces, of course, but in that vision on values, do we need to think about, we might have to force this because our society has no value anymore connected to nature, right? It's very little valued. We don't even care about how clothes feel on us, and you know that natural fibers feel better. We don't even care anymore. We're wearing synthetic fibers all day long, and we don't even think twice about it, right? Let alone the food we put inside our body. which can actually poison us. So is that a consideration maybe in the values of forcing nature back into education, into spirituality? And you mentioned about gardens at church. It's very fascinating. But going even further beyond that, because could we ever can we ever design a food system that is valued on nature if we don't understand it? And I fear that there is such a lack of understanding of basic nature principles, right? In all of us now, right? And I'm an ex-biologist as well, but I feel 25 years away from biology compared to where I started. So it's a question, and Roy, I don't know if you can mention some of those common threads that you saw in those visions, but how much that connection with nature came up.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, I have the microphone and I have a question. So the first night here, there was an event, and one of the speakers was saying that farmers get one shot, maybe two, a year to make all their income. And to say you have to change what you're doing, you have to try a whole new strategy because we think it'll be better for the environment, may actually contradict certain other values that they have, which is reliability, predictability, financial security for their family. Like Roy says he would do anything for his children and grandchildren. Well, maybe he would, in that position, I don't know, I don't mean to speak for you, maybe in that position, the thing that I would do is resist the allure of fighting climate change and instead stick to what I know works. Because if I don't do that, then my children may not get fed this year or may not have all the resources they need. And what that speaks to me about is actually the food system side of it. Because there's a difference between asking a person to make a change in their daily life, a farmer to make a change in her daily life, and having a whole system that allows them to do so. So that may be some kind of insurance a special insurance for those who want to try different kinds of regenerative farming or what have you. And I'm curious about what kinds of systems you have seen that allow for these values to overcome the inertia, the well-justified inertia that other values may force them to have. So maybe you said more clearly, how does that farmer have a system that allows him or her to take a risk and overcome those other forces that may make him or her unwilling to do so for the good of their family?
Thank you, Dan, for the question. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. So I don't know, Roy, if you want to respond directly to the question that was posed to you, the number of questions, and then maybe we can open it up to see if the panelists have any kind of final thoughts or if there are any final thoughts from the audience.
Well, I think it ties in with this theme of, the biggest problem we are facing is we have isolated ourselves from each other and from nature. All right, and when you create those isolation, when you create that kind of separateness, the otherness, you then create situations where farmers have those kinds of choices. Whereas if we saw each other as really connected, as integral with nature, we would, and I do think there are societies that do a better job of that than others, and it is, not always related to successful economies, but where people recognize my father's Swiss, and they've made a very clear decision that they're going to protect their beautiful countryside, and it costs money to do that, but they've, as a society, have decided to do that because of this recognition. I think there's lots of but I think this is the other where if you take a system perspective, the overall value you create, and it's not just economic value, but it's spiritual and cultural and other value, is much greater than when you're thinking of the whole than when you don't. Kind of going back to the nature, I do think all of the visions, all of them wanted us to get more connected back with nature, and I think that's because there's something we feel more healthy when we're surrounded by nature. And there's actually a ton of scientific evidence that shows, right, that when you are walking through a forest, you're breathing in things that actually enable your emotional well-being to go up. When you're eating healthy food that's full of microbes, your emotional well-being goes, like, it's so clear, but we still keep creating these very artificial, broken systems that don't serve, they end up actually not serving anybody well. Right? And that's what we're in right now.
So maybe, I mean, taking the point about nature and saying that we're actually quite removed from it, so it's very hard to apply a value to something we don't know. Are we making the values too specific, too context specific? Because if it's around nature, I mean, a value of protection and a value of restoration, you can apply that to many parts of the food system and many different contexts within the food system. If you say that, you know, regeneration, protection, both of those are values that you live by and that you work by, that you do by, that are the every bit fundamental who you are, then you can apply that in different contexts. So you can apply it to nature. You can apply it to maybe how you invest if you're an investor, how you buy produce, how you consume. It doesn't necessarily need to be about the context. You can bring that in later. I think if you maybe simplify rather than specify the context in which those values apply, maybe that's the way you do it, and that's how you overcome that disconnection with things like nature and the environment.
Would any of our other panelists like to jump in at this point?
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to his question about the farmer. I mean, obviously, we don't only want the consumers to do the right thing, we also want the farmers on the food production side to do the correct thing. And if I look at, let's say, one country where, like the country I come from in Germany, we have still overconsumption of meat in Germany. I mean, the good news is that currently, if you look at the vegan and vegetarian and flexitarianists, they are now a majority in Germany, so there is some development on that side, which is encouraging. But overall, there's still a meat consumption which is too high. And this does not only cause stress on climate and food security in other places on the world, or on water use, land use, on the biodiversity, but it also causes costs in the health system in Germany, because people who eat unhealthy get sick much more easy, and they need to be treated by the medical system. So what I would propose and what I would like to see is some top-down policies taken by the German government, but also by other governments in countries which have a similar problem, is to basically do one thing is do a sustainability check on all your subsidies in the food system and try to remove those subsidies which are harmful to sustainability, and take this money instead to give subsidies out which are beneficial for sustainability. And also change the taxonomy, like we all know it from the smoking cigarettes and tobacco is bad for your health, so there are quite a heavy taxes on it. So we could also have higher taxes on meat consumption, for example, and all this money can be used to help the farmer, which you mentioned, to shift his production to more organic farming practices, and practices which are more sustainable with the planetary boundaries. So what I see, especially in the food system at the moment, is there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of bottom-up approach by corporations, by individuals, by NGOs and so forth, by several players. But what I'm still missing is a bit of a top-down approach to help accelerate the shift to a more sustainable food system.
I might add on to that as well about the farmer, because the farmer is the first active agent of society. And it's important that we remember as well the value of farmers in the food systems, because often they're neglected or forgotten or not seen as high value as they should be. And one of the challenges that this also presents, if we think about the future of food systems, is the role of youth. Because often youth don't see agriculture or food as being profitable or avenue worth pursuing. And this becomes problematic because within our food systems, the average age of farmers globally is, around over 60 years old. And that knowledge that's generated intergenerationally, or traditional knowledge, the values of those, how do we treat food, how we treat the land, how we treat each other, will become lost. And so it will also require us to think of how do we think about future generations and how they view these systems? How do we engage youth in a way that's meaningful? How do we engage youth to become empowered to be part of these systems and bring sort of those new insights and new values into already pre-existing systems, so that we can sort of merge both the past, the present, and the future?
Just picking up on what you were saying about youth, and then the point made from the audience about the faith communities and the faith leaders. I think we're talking about this very much in terms of individuals and how they're living and breathing the values and working the values. But actually, people exist in communities, and those communities often sort of overlap in different ways. Youth communities, faith communities. In all of those communities, you get leaders. And actually, I think those are key people in enabling us to start living values more, living, breathing, working, eating values. And I think if that's a way that we can sort of scale up the values and a values-based approach, it's by looking at leaders and looking to leaders of these communities to take their flock, to take the people that they work with, and to show that actually there is a different way of doing things. You don't have to work in the systems that we've got in place at the moment. You can take a different approach. You can take a different approach to food systems transformation, to producing food, to consuming food, to selling food. And I think that community-based approach has huge value. But we just need to find the leaders, and we need to find a way to involve them in the creation of these values, of these shared values. And I think that would be a really valuable step forward. I don't think it's the one solution we should go for, but I think it definitely would help.
Thomas, I'd like to invite you if there's anything you would like to add at this point before I give a quick summary of some of the threads of our conversation.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I can add much. I really appreciate the last point on, the young people, because we know that, sociologically in societies, often values evolve through change, generational change. So I think that's, that's interesting entry points. Now, what can I add? No, thank you. I don't think I have much to add.
I put you on the spot there.
Okay, that's fine.
So in the last few minutes, I just wanted to pull out again, like some threads of our conversation that we had together, and we touched on so many things, and I think many of these points we could open up into a whole conversation. But a few things stood out to me, and one is this interplay between the individual and the collective. And we talked a little bit about the role of the individual, and we mentioned kind of conditioning. We talked about the insistent self and the ego and this kind of drive for a materialistic life and a life of status. We talked about kind of the individual role of the family and maybe this kind of connection with family as opposed to media, kind of that nurturing environment that we're creating. But then also in terms of a collective, that there are these community-based approaches, faith-based communities, other kind of collective forms of action, but that there's a connection between the two. An individual in a certain context will take on a particular set of values, yet also the individual has an ability to shape the values that the collective then comes to adopt. But that somehow this interplay between values, behavior, and choices, and that probably is the second thread that I wanted to pull out from our conversation today, is this notion of agency. Is choice a luxury? Is this piece around values kind of allowing us, how do we overcome this inertia for survival and this pull towards addressing the needs of the short term? So then what allows one to have the choice to choose a value-based approach? What is that foundation? And I think that question kind of rang through many of the comments. Where is that agency, and what is the foundation that is needed to allow for that agency individually and collectively? And maybe the third thread that I would pull out is one of integration. These systems are so complex. We're trying to integrate many, many individuals globally, institutions globally. We touched on policy. We touched on all of these kind of different actors that are trying to come together and the bodies of knowledge that are trying to become integrated. But what does it mean to then have an inclusive dialogue or an integrated knowledge base that then can inform the decisions that we make, so that one feels, whether you're operating in an organization or you're making these choices as an individual, that you are fully informed and that your choices come from an integrated foundation. So I know there were many things. We have like 1 or 2 minutes left. I don't know if there's anyone who wanted to have a final. I did see some additional hands who didn't get a chance to speak. So now is the chance if you did want to speak. Yes? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for all your comments. Oh, can everybody hear me there? I just had a question pulling up on what people have said about connection and the importance of connection, and then embedding values in frameworks and embedding that approach in kind of structures and frameworks. And thinking about the COP, I guess I'm not entirely convinced that it's always facilitating connections at COP, particularly between people of different values or different views. And what would you change in the COP spaces to enable those connections?
Roy just said that was a whole other panel. Actually, I mean, I would challenge that. I think we are. I mean, I think, you know, the food community here today in this building is an example of how that's working. So it may not be working necessarily on the policy level, but for non-state actors, being here, being together, having exposure to different ideas, to that diversity that I spoke about at the start, the diversity of the food system, the diversity of approaches, diversity of people within that food system is so, so important. I mean, I feel I've been here a week already. I've got another week to go. I'm already pretty exhausted. But I'm exhausted because I'm speaking to so many people that are challenging my perspectives, giving me something to think about, sparking new ideas. I'm connecting other people. And this is amazing. I mean, it gives me so much hope. The negotiations, I can't say the same for that. But the non-state actor action is immense, especially around food at the moment. And I don't know, I've not managed to get to the Faith Pavilion because I've been stuck in this bottom floor of this building for the last week. But I'm sure it's the same there as well. You know, the interfaith community coming together. This is a really key moment, and that is exactly what gives me hope. This is what enables us to have conversations like this and moves us forward. And I truly feel this is what is going to save people and planet. It's not going to be the negotiations and the policymakers stuck in rooms arguing about pieces of text. It's going to be what we do by the connections we make, the deep human connections. And that is it. That is the point, you know. I think we separate off the two, and then we have something to hope for and something to move forward to.
Yeah, I would like to add on that. I mean, from my experience, I can fully agree to what Lucy said. My first COP was COP23 in Bonn a few years ago. And back then, we were still like going through all the list of side events and press conferences, checking, is there anything about food? Is there anything about food systems? And there was really not a lot at that time. And now this has all evolved over the years. We get to know more and more like-minded people. We are a big community now, and this COP here is really another step forward, as we have all the food-related content in even one building, which is really convenient. So it allows us to collaborate even closer and even more. And one good example is also the Food at COP initiative. I don't know whether you're aware of it, but there's an initiative from several participants here at COP and organizations, which Tsuchi is also part of, promoting that all the food which is served at the COP conference itself is plant-based. So we tried it on all the COPs, and finally at this COP, the COP presidency said, yeah, we recognize this, and we ensure that at least the majority of the food is plant-based. I think it's about 3/4 of the food actually is now plant-based. So, and this is really some success which is coming from all the participants and all the people here at COP by collaborating together. Yeah.
Thank you. So we are unfortunately out of time. I think that's a wonderful point to end on, is to think about how we can continue these collaborations and to have these conversations with those who are, you know, coming from different backgrounds here at COP. Please keep these conversations going. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for the insights and the wisdom that you shared, and also to everybody who participated and contributed to our conversation today. So thank you all so much, and enjoy your evening.
Weekend.
Testing. Hello. Thomas, we're taking a picture, so stay on.